Hello there! In this tutorial, we are going to create a really basic Minecraft clone in Python. And well, it works like any other Minecraft game. You can create blocks, you can destroy blocks, and I also have different blocks that you can just switch to, just to make it a bit easier. And there are quite a few different ones, and you can just work with them and play around. Pretty straightforward when it comes down to it. And of course, with that, you can make, well, in my case, a really simple house. But if you wanted to, you could just add more stuff to it, or get rid of stuff. Well, it's basically how Minecraft works. And all of this is made with the Ursina Game Engine, so let's talk about that one. The Ursina Game Engine was released sometime last year, and it's a really neat engine. It can do really powerful stuff with very few lines of code. For example, the entire game you just saw took about 90 lines of code to write. And you can make it in about an hour. It's really easy. So it's quite a good engine for beginners, I feel. And especially for 3D games, Ursina is quite a bit more powerful than Pygame, for example. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have problems. And there's one big warning I do have to give, that the Ursina Game Engine is only available for Windows and Linux. So if you have macOS, I'm really sorry, this tutorial is not going to be for you. But with all of that out of the way, let's first do a brief introduction to the Ursina Game Engine, and once we have the basics covered, we can actually come to making the game. So for this part, we're talking about how Ursina works and how we can make some basic stuff with it. And obviously, the very first thing you have to do is to install it. So in the PowerShell, type pip install Ursina, and then you should see a fairly lengthy dialog to install it, and once that's done, you should be good to go. This works like literally any other module for Python. And once you have installed it, go to the code editor of your choice, in my case Sublime, and type import Ursina. And now if you run it, you should be getting a message that is something like this. The really important part you're looking for here is that you're not getting an error message. If you don't, you have installed it properly. And now that we have that, let me close it, we can actually start working in Ursina. And the first thing we need to do is that I don't want to import Ursina by itself. Instead, I want to go from Ursina, import everything, so star. And the reason for that is that there are lots of objects that rely on Ursina. And having to type Ursina every time is going to be quite cumbersome. And now we need 2 lines to create the entire game. The first line is to create the basic instance of the game. And this has to be stored in a variable that I'm going to call app. And to create this one, all we have to type is Ursina, and make sure the first letter is capitalized. That one is important. And once we have that, what I want to do is app.run. So I create an instance and I run the instance. And with that, if I run my code now, we get a really basic window. We can see our frame rate and we can close the window. That's about it. Nothing much happens yet. But it's already a really good start that we have our window with just 2 lines of code. So for example, this would be much easier than Pygame, for example. Now we have to figure out how can we actually put stuff on the screen. And for that, we have to understand the most important concept for Ursina, and that is called entities. And an entity in Ursina can basically be anything. It can be a square, it can be a cube, it can be a circle, it could also be a button. Basically, anything you see on the screen is going to be an entity. And then when you create this entity, you can customize it quite a bit. And once it's created, it's automatically added to the game. So all you have to take care of is creating it, and then you're good to go. So let's create one. I want to create, let's call it test square, where I just want to create a basic square on the screen. And for that, we have to create an entity. And now we have to give it a couple of arguments. The first one is what's called the model. And this one determines what kind of shape it's going to take. So is it going to be a cube? Is it going to be a square? Is it going to be a circle? And for now, let's just go with circle. That tends to be a really easy shape. And with that, we would get a circle. And now let's give it a color argument. And for that, I need the color keyword. And to assign it any color, I need the keyword color. And then the color I want to go with. Let's say for now, let's go with red. And with that, we should have a red circle. So let me run the code. And we can see a red circle right in the middle of our screen. So this one's working really well. And what you can do now is change this circle to something else. So for example, if you want a square, you would need the quad keyword. And if I run the code now, we get a square. Now you could, if you wanted a cube, So a three-dimensional object, you could type cube in here. Although if I run this, because we're looking at only one side of this cube, we can't really see it. But we're going to come to that in just a bit. For now, don't worry about it. And let's leave it at a quad for now. That one's the easiest to see. And what you can also do in the parameters here is you can, for example, set a scale. And then there you can pass in a tuple with the x and the y scale. So if I passed in, let's say, 1 and 4, we would stretch it 4 on the y and 1 on the x-axis. And of course, you could also change the position. And this could, for example, be, let's say, 5 and 1, and let's see what happens. So now we have moved the entire thing 1 unit upwards and 5 units to the right. And a really important thing here is that the origin point is in the center of the screen. So y has to be positive if you want to go up, it has to be negative if you want to go down. Kind of like it would make sense. And just to demonstrate it, let's make this a higher value to 4. And now we get even higher. So this would be quite different compared to Pygame, for example. So now we have a basic thing on the screen. How could we move it? And that is also really easy in Ursina, because all we need is to create a function, so def, and this function has to be called update. It doesn't need any arguments, and this update function is going to be called by Ursina on every frame automatically. So as long as you have this name and the function, you are good to go. So for example, what I could be doing in here is just to print test, and then run the entire thing. And now in the console, you can see we get test quite a bit. And now, if I wanted to move this test square, all I would have to do is to get the object itself, and then influence one parameter. For now, let's go with x. And I could just change the values. So I could go with -=1, which would move it to the left. Although, if I were to run this right now, it would go really fast. So this is way too fast. And this would also not adjust to different frame rates, so this would be quite inconsistent. But all we have to do to fix that is to add time.delta. So this is the time between different frames. So if we multiply this with the movement speed, our object is going to move in accordance with the frame rate, which is going to make our game quite smooth. So now let's try it again. And there we go. This feels much better. Cool. And we could even make it a bit faster. Let's go with -=4. And yeah, that feels better. Cool. Now you could make this even more sophisticated by adding keyboard input. And for that, all you need is held keys. And from that, we just have to pass in one specific key. Let's say in my case, A. And now I have to indent this. And I can just run the game again. And now this thing is only going to move to the right if I press A. And that's all we need. And this could be any letter on your keyboard, any number, or even your mouse keys. It's really flexible. And alright, with that we have our basic object and we have a way to move it. Now, what we can also do, let me add another square, and let's call this suns. You see in a second why. And for this one, I want to add a custom texture, so that I can add any kind of picture I want into this. And for this, I am still going to need an entity. And the entity is supposed to be a quad again. So we're getting a square. And now I want to add a custom picture to this. And for that, I will need the texture keyword. And now for the texture, I have to create a texture. And there are a couple of ways of doing it. The one I would recommend is to create a texture in its own variable. And then we need the keyword load texture. And then you can select from your folder. In my case, I have a folder called assets. And in that folder, I have a file called sans.png. And now that, I can just pass in here. And let's try now. Let's see what happens. And now we get Sans from Undertale. Pretty nice and easy. And we can actually make this easier. We don't actually have to do this entire line. We could just pass this straight into here and it would load automatically. So if I run this now, this would also work perfectly fine. So this would be fine, but I generally feel like importing all your textures at the beginning is a more readable way to approach this. But it's ultimately up to you. So with that, we have a couple of really simple objects in our game. But in an actual game, you really want to have more control over all of these things. So this kind of thing is generally just to create really simple ones. If we wanted to create more complex ones, we could also do that. And for that, we would have to create an entirely class that inherits from an entity, for example. So let's create a more complex cube. And with that, we can also go into 3D. So I want to create a new class, and let's call this one test cube. And this one has to inherit from entity. And now in there, I want to create an init method. It needs self and nothing else. Or you could pass something in there, would be fine. And in there, I want my super method, and then the init. And now when I initiate the parent, I can specify a ton of different arguments. So in here, for example, I could create a model. For now, I want a cube. I could give it a color. Let's give it, let's say the color white, just for now. And then, of course, I can also give it a texture. And Ursina has a couple of textures inbuilt that you can use. One of those is called white_cube. So this one you don't have to load, it's inbuilt into Ursina. And with this, we have our own class that we can add lots of stuff to. That is something we are going to do in just a bit. And now all we have to do to create an actual block from this class is, well, to call it. So let me call my test cube. And this is supposed to be my test cube class. And now if I run this, we can see a white cube right in the middle of our screen. And you can't really see that it's a cube yet, so let's give it some rotation. And for that, all I have to do is to give it a rotation argument, and this one needs to be a vector 3, with the x, y, and z rotation. And let's just go with 45, 45, and 45. So now if I run this, we can see our cube. So this one is working pretty well. And you could still move this thing around with position, and this would work perfectly well. Now with that, we have already quite a few things covered. But there's one more concept we need before we can get to the actual game. And that is to create a button. And buttons work slightly differently. Or well, not that much. Let's actually create one that's going to be the fastest way. So to create a button, I still have to create a class. And I'm going to call it test button. And this one has to inherit from a class called button itself. And now here, I have to create again a done_there_init method that needs self. And inside of that, I want to get my super method and init that one. And in here, I can create lots of different stuff for the button. So for example, my button could be a cube, just like my test cube. I could give it a texture. And let's say another inbuilt one is called brick. I could give it a color. And this one would be, let's go with color blue, just to use one we haven't seen yet. And with that, we have a really basic button. Let's actually create it. And let me get rid of the test cube, just so we don't have it in the way. So now instead of test cube, I want a test button. And now if I run this, we can see a giant button. And you can see if I hover over it, it gets slightly brighter. But now it is kind of weird how buttons work, because this button is significantly larger than this test cube. And the reason for that is that a test button needs one more argument, and it's called the parent argument. And the parent we need is the scene, so the actual game scene again. And now if I run this again, now we can see the normal size button. I am not actually sure why the parent argument is needed for the test button, but not for the test cube. It's a little bit weird. But if you want to create a button, this has to be parented to the scene, and that's the actual game. What we can also do for a button is to give it different colors depending on what you do with it. So for example, there is a highlight_color argument that changes the color if we hover over the button. So this could, for example, be color, let's go with red. And then we also have a pressed_color, and this is the color we get when the button is pressed. And for this one, let's go with color.lime. And now if I run this again, we get our button. If I hover over it, it becomes red, and if I click it, it becomes green. So this one is working quite well. And now, how could we use a button? And well, this one is also incredibly easy. all we have to do is to create a new method that is called input. It needs self as usual, and then it needs one more argument that is called key. And that's the key we are pressing to activate it. And now inside of that method, we have to create an if statement that if self.hovered. So if our mouse is over the button. And inside of that, what we want to check is if key, so the key we pass into it, is equal to the left mouse button argument, which is called left mouse down. And if that is the case, let's just print button pressed. And now, if I run all of this, it's still working. And if I press on the button, we get button pressed. So this one is working pretty well. And with that, we can actually come to the game. So let's talk about Minecraft. And really, the one important thing you have to know about Minecraft is that Minecraft is a voxel-based game. And really, all that means is that every single block that you see in Minecraft is a voxel. So these are the things that we have to create ourselves. But besides that, there really isn't all that much else that we do need. So let's actually jump straight into our code again and let's have a look at this. Alright, welcome back. I have gotten rid of all the code I have used to explain Ursina itself. So all we have now, if I run the code, is an empty window that we can use to create an actual game. And the first thing I have to do is to create a new class for all the voxels we want to create. So the class is going to be called voxel. And this one has to inherit from the button class. For the simple reason that whenever I click on a voxel, I want to create another voxel right next to it. So I need to know where each voxel is. That's why it's a button. And in here, we need our init method again. Need self and nothing else for now at least. And let me just type it properly. And in here, we again need the super method with the underscore init. And now we have to specify a couple of arguments. The first one is parent, the one that we have seen earlier. This would be scene. So the actual scene of the game. Next up, we would need a position. And the position for now, let me just place it at 0, 0, and 0. Although this we are going to change later when we set up the game. Next up, I want to create a model. So what the thing is going to look like. And this one for now is going to be a cube. Although this also is going to change at least somewhat. Then I need the origin Y. So effectively the height in 3D space of this cube. And this one is going to be 0.5. And once we have that, we need a texture so we can actually see the cube. And for the texture, for now, I'm just going to go with white underscore cube, the one that we have seen earlier. And this also we are going to change in just a bit. For now, I just want to have a basic setup. And next up, we are going to need a color. And one important thing, you need both a texture and a color. And both of these colors are going to be multiplied together. So if you only have the texture and no color, it is going to look weird. And for now, let's just stick with white. I think that's going to be fine. And besides that, I also want to create a highlight underscore color. And this one, let's go with color.lime. So really all that's happening here is we create a button that is going to be a cube with a white texture. And if we hover over it, then it's going to be lime colored. Then we have a position 0, 0, and 0, so it's right in the middle, except it's slightly lifted up by 0.5. That's all that's happening here. So now that we have all of that, we have to create our button. And for that, let me put it right between those two lines of code. I could just create voxel is equal to voxel, and let's actually run this and let's see what happens. So now we can see one button and it becomes greenish when we hover over it. So this one, well, it's a start. But I don't just want to create a single button, I want to create multiple. And to create multiple buttons, really all I need is for z in, let's go with range of 8. So I want to create 8 blocks in the z space. And inside of that, I'm going to go for x in range 8. So effectively what I have done is I have gone forwards and backwards by 8 units, and then I've also gone left and right for each of these units. And now what I can do in there is to create a voxel. And then this voxel is always going to get the voxel class itself. So this way we are creating 64 voxels. And now if I run this, we still can't really see it. And the reason for that right now is because they are all in the same position. So this one doesn't really help us. So I have to place in some kind of information in here to customize the position. So when I call this class on the init method, I want to give it a position that by default is supposed to be 0, 0, and 0. So that we always end up with this position if nothing is passed in here. And this one is getting position. So if I run this again now, nothing is going to change. But what I can do now when I create all of these voxels, I can pass in x, 0, and z. So that we actually use this information and this information to place each individual voxel. So now if I run this again, we are getting an error because all of this has to be a tuple. And I could even give it the position keyword, and now let's try this again. There we go. Now we can see all of them right next to each other. The problem now is how can we actually create a first-person character in all of this? And in here, Ursina makes this incredibly easy because it has a couple of predefined classes that we can use to just create a first-person character. We don't really have to do anything ourselves for that. And really, all we have to do is to import something else first. And what we have to import is from Ursina.prefabs.first_person_controller. And then import first person controller. I hope I spelled that right. So this by default is not being imported into Ursina. So we have to do it ourselves. But once we do have it, all we have to do to create a first person character is to create a new variable where we store it and then call first person controller. And this is also a class, so we have to call it. And now I can run the game and we get a first person player. So, well, with that, we already have really the basics of what we need for a game. And the buttons all still work, and the collision between them also works automatically, so you don't have to worry about this at all, which is really powerful. And now, if you do want to close the game because you can't use the mouse anymore, I just switch between my windows and then close it from there. This tends to be the easiest. And cool. Now we have our first person controller. And if you want to make all of this larger, we could go with something like 20 times 20. And now we have a much larger field. Although one of the problems with the game right now is that if you added too many of these fields, the game would slow down. So there would be quite a bit of optimization work to do. But alright, what we have to figure out now is how to make all of this more interactive. So how can you create and destroy blocks? And again, this is going to be super easy. Because effectively what we want to do is that if you press on a voxel button, then we want to create a new block on that position. So the first thing we have to do is to create a new button press functionality. And this is something we have seen earlier. Because this voxel is just a button that we can press. So we can give it an input method. And this one needs self and key, separated by a comma. And in here, again, I need if self.hovered. And now I want to check is if key is equal to left mouse down. And if that is the case, I want to create a new voxel. And this one again is going to need the voxel class. So really what's happening in here is if we are pressing this button, we are creating a new button in a certain position that we can specify. And now we actually have to specify the position of this button. And there are two parts we have to combine. The first one is self.position. So that we get the position of the button we are pressing right now. But then we have to add mouse.normal. And once we have that, I can actually try all of this and see if it works. So now if I press on any button, we get a new, well, voxel button cube thing. So this one is actually a pretty good start. So what's happening here? And let me explain in the game that's going to be the easiest. So here we have some more space. So right now I'm looking at this button here, or this voxel. So I get the position of the voxel itself. And the normal is the surface we are looking at. So right now the normal is pointing upwards. And this is what we are using when we create the new voxel button. That we want to get the position itself plus the upward direction. So when we press it, that's where we are going to create the new voxel button. And this we can do for any kind of surface. That we just get the position itself plus the surface we are pointing at and in what way it's facing. And once we have that, we can really create all the different cubes that we wanted. And this is pretty much a perfect Minecraft functionality. So really nice. What we can do now is to add another if statement if we wanted to destroy all of these boxes. So if key is equal to right mouse down, and all I need to destroy a button is the destroy self. And this is literally all we needed. So now I can run the thing again. And if I left click, I create a voxel. If I right click, I destroy it. And with that, we can even create our bottom itself and fall into a bottomless pit of nothingness. Yay, it's working. And one more thing that we could be doing is to change the color and give it a bit more variety. So right now, every single block is perfectly white, which, well, tends to get a little bit boring, even if we added textures. So instead what we can do is to give it color.color, and in here we can specify RGB values. And in my case, I want this to be 0 and 0, and then I want random.uniform. And this is supposed to be between 0.9 and 1, so that the color of every block is going to be slightly random. And now if I run this, it still works, and now each of these blocks gets a slightly different shade of gray. Although there's one more thing that I am slightly confused about, is that what these specific arguments in here mean is a bit confusing. Because if you change this one from 0 to 1, nothing really seems to change. However, if you change the second one to a 1, now the entire thing is going to be red. So I assume these values are going to be RGBA, but I'm really not entirely sure. But let's leave it for now as it is, and it's perfectly fine. And alright, with that, we have a really basic setup for a very simple and nice game setup that works kind of like Minecraft. And all of this is exactly the same setup for one of the demos for Ursina, and this is exactly what I have copied. So if you've gotten this far, you have basically replicated one demo from the Ursina game. So definitely check out the GitHub page. And there are lots more examples. I would really recommend to check them out. They're really fun to play around in. But alright, now that we have our basic setup, we can make all of this look much better. And there are a couple of things that we need to make all of this work. And let's start by creating proper cubes that we can use. This is going to be the biggest change that we can make. And to create proper blocks with the proper textures, we do have to cover one specific topic. That right now we have used an inbuilt cube, which worked decently fine, but it's very limited in terms of how you can add a texture to it. And the reason for that is that there's no UV map for it. And a UV map is basically how you wrap a texture around a cube, or really any 3D object. And the default cube in Ursina doesn't really have a UV map, so when we applied a proper texture to it, it wouldn't really work. So what we have to do is to create our own block and apply a texture to it, and then import all of that into Ursina, which fortunately is really easy. And I have used Blender to create a basic block. And in the project folder for this game, I'm going to link the Blender file in case you want to have a look at this. But I'm going to import the finished file itself, which is going to be the most straightforward way. But let's go through it step by step. That's going to be the easiest one. So here I'm back in my code. And the first thing I want to do is to get rid of this cube. And instead what I want to do is to import from my assets folder. And there I have a file called block. And this is assets/block. And this block is a block I have created in Blender that has a UV map. So if we applied a more proper texture to it, it would show up properly. As a matter of fact, I have created a couple of textures. And just to save me some typing, let me paste them all in. So I have a grass texture, I have a stone texture, I have a brick texture, and I have a dirt texture. And all of these get a texture loaded right into the game. And now I don't want to use the white cube texture anymore. Instead, for now, let's just go with the grass texture. And let's actually look how this looks. And if I run this now, we get an error. For the simple reason that we first have to create Ursina, and only then we can load textures. So I need app is equal to Ursina first, and then I can run all of this. And now let's try it again. This should be working now. And there we go. Now, you can kind of see the problem that the positioning is kind of messed up. And the reasoning here is that the default buttons are a different size from the buttons we have imported. But that we can change very easily. All we need is scale is equal to 0.5. So now if I try this again, now this looks much better. And I can still create all of the blocks, and I get my basic blocks. So this one is still working exactly the same way, except now we have a nicer looking texture added. And also what I want to do now, I want to get rid of this highlight color because it makes the entire thing look kind of weird. So now let's try it again. And yeah, I feel this is looking a bit better, but you could leave it if you wanted to. All right, so now we're making some progress. But I don't want this grass texture every time. Instead, I want to be able to pick from any of these textures. So what I want to do is when I create this voxel class, I want to assign it a texture. And by default, this should be the grass texture. But if I specify the keyword, this could be any texture in here. So now if I run all of this again, we should still see the same outcome. Cool. But now what we could be doing is when we are specifying the voxel itself, let's do it down here. Actually, let's do it up here so you can see the difference a bit better. So whenever I click on a voxel, I want to give it a more specific texture. And let's go with the stone texture. So now the default voxels are going to be the grass texture, but when I click on one, I'm creating a stone texture, or a stone. So now if I click on something, we are getting a stone. Cool, this is working pretty well. And really, all we have to do now is to figure out some kind of input that we can select specific kind of textures. And what I have done is I have created an update function. So the same thing we have seen earlier. And this one is going to be run on every single frame. And effectively what I have done in here, I have created a new variable, actually outside of it, that I've called block_pick. And by default, this is 1. And then all I'm doing in here is if held_keys 1, then I want to set block_pick to 1. And now I can copy this thing a couple of times and change this to 2, 3, and 4, and then 2, 3, and 4. And I have to set this to global block pick. So really all that's happening in here is that if I press any of these buttons, this block pick gets a different number. And this we can then use further down here to influence how this entire thing is going to look. So instead of just creating a texture itself, I also want to check if block pick is equal to 1. And if that is the case, only then do I want to create a voxel with the, let's put this one for the grass texture. And I think I can put all of them on the same line. It makes it a bit more readable. And with that, I am only going to create a grass texture if block pick is equal to 1. But let's say if I pressed 2, then I want to create a stone texture. If I picked 3, I want this to be I think I called this a brick texture. It was indeed a brick texture. And then for number 4, I want this to be a dirt texture. And all right, let's try this now. Let's see what happens. So I'm still in my basic game. If I clicked just by itself, we get this. But now if I press 2 on my keyboard and try this again, we're getting a stone block. If I press 3, we're getting a brick. And if I press 4, we're getting some dirt. Or however you call this one. And all right, this is really starting to come together. So this is already helping to make the game look nicer. But there are 3 more elements that can really help to bring the game across. Number 1 is a skybox, number 2 is a hand, and number 3 is sounds. And let's go through them step by step. The first one is a skybox. And a skybox basically is that we can see a sky. But to emulate this in our game, all we basically do is we create a giant sphere that has a sky texture on it. That's really all it is. And well, we can go straight to creating it. It's super easy to do. So here I'm back in my code. And what I want to do is to create a new class that I'm going to call sky. And this one is just going to inherit from entity. And in there, I need def init, and it needs self, nothing else. And in there, I need my super, and then init. And in here, we have to specify a couple of things. The first one, just to be sure, is the parent, which needs to be the scene. So we're part of the actual game. But now for the model, we need something new. And that is a sphere. So, well, a round object. And now for the texture, I want to create a sky texture. And this one doesn't exist yet, but all we have to do is to import it. So in my textures, I want a sky texture. And let me line it up properly. I want to load the texture again. And in my assets folder, there is one file that is called skybox.png. And this is the one I want to use. Let me add a bit more space below the class itself. And this would actually already give us something. So let me actually create it. So below the player, I am also going to create a new variable called sky. And this one gets my sky class. And let's run the entire thing and see what happens. I'm getting an error because this is supposed to be a comma. Now we go. Okay, right now I can't see anything, but if I turn around, there we can see a very tiny world. So this thing we want to scale up massively. And really all we have to do is to give it a scale argument. And in there I passed in 150. So now if I run this again, we can't see anything. And well, the reason for that is that this texture right now is only on the outside. So if we are inside of this object, we can't see it. But we can change this very easily. All we need is double underscore sided, and this needs to be true. And now if I run this again, this should be working. And there we go. Now this is looking much nicer. Although this isn't the perfect sky texture, especially you can see it there, there's one seam. This is where the texture start and end connect. So, well, this isn't great, but I think it's good enough for now. So with that, we have our sky. Now I can close this class and never think about it again. Now the next thing I'm going to need is a hand, and this one is purely decorative. It doesn't really do anything besides simulating having a hand. It's a really simple thing. And for that, we are going to learn one new thing, but I think this is best explained while actually implementing it. And I want to create a new class that I call hand. And this one is also going to be an entity. And in there, as always, I need my thunder init method that needs self and nothing else. And inside of that, I need my super and then init for that one. And in here, we have to specify the parent. But the parent is not going to be the scene. Instead, it is going to be camera.ui. And let me explain what that is. So far, we have only used the scene, and this is the actual 3D space of our game. The camera UI is the actual 2D space of our camera. So if you want to create a UI, it would be on this space. And this one is not going to move along with the game itself. It's just a static space that is kind of on top of the game itself. It's essentially a glass sheet that the player is looking through. Or in most other game engines, this would be a viewport. This would also be a good way to think about it. Now, what I also want is to give this a model. And again, I have a custom model that is in my assets folder. and it's just called arm. And this also has a texture. And the texture, let's load it straight in there. And I called this one arm texture. Then needs an equal and load texture. And this one is also an assets. And I've called this one arm texture.png. And now I can assign this texture. It's arm texture. And with that, we have our basic hand. Let's actually create this object using the class. So I call this hand, and let's see what happens. So, well, it's a touch large, I feel. So what we have to do for now is to make this entire thing a little bit smaller. So I want to go scale 0.2 with an equal sign. And let's try this now. And now we get a much better proportioned hand, although it's pointing right at us, so that's not great. And for that, all I have to do is to give it a rotation and a position. And the rotation is going to be a vector 3, and the rotation I went with is 150, -10, and 0. And let's try this now. And there we go. Now we can see our hand a little bit better, although it's still in the completely wrong position. But, well, we are making progress, and the rest still works perfectly fine. So now, let's give it a position. So position is equal to, and this needs to be a vector 2, because we're moving in a 2D space. And I have moved this 0.4 to the right, and then downwards by -0.6. And now let's try this again. And now this is looking much nicer. Cool. So with that, we have a basic hand. But right now it doesn't animate, and well, that looks a bit weird. So let's add a really basic animation. Although calling it an animation is, well, kind of overkill. Because all I've effectively done is that if the player presses the mouse button, their hand is in one position. If the mouse button is not pressed, the hand is in the default position. That's really all that's happening here. It's not really an animation. But you could very easily make it one. All I really have to do is to create a method for this hand that I called active. And it needs self. And in there, I changed the hand position and rotation to be more in the middle of the screen. So I need self position and self.rotation. And no comma or bracket afterward. And for the position, I went with 0.3 and -0.5. And the rotation I actually didn't touch, so we can just leave it as it is. And then for the other state, passive, also needs self. And for this one, I just took this position and assigned it to it. So self.position. So now we have two methods that can influence the position of the hand. And if I click the mouse, I want the active method to run. If I don't click the mouse, I want the passive method to run. So with that, I have to go to my update function and add another if statement in here. And let's do it right at the top, although it doesn't really matter. And really all I want to do is if held keys has left mouse or held keys is equal to right mouse. So if we're pressing the left mouse button or the right mouse button, we want to trigger one of these. And here's something slightly weird, that if you use the update function, you have to use the left mouse. However, when you use a button, you have to use the left mouse down. So there's a slight difference. Be careful with that. But all right, now we have our if statement. And all I have to do in there is either hand.active. And if that's not the case, I want hand.passive. And that's literally all we have to do for the hand. And if I run the code now, and if I click, my hand moves a tiny bit. Or at least we get the illusion of a movement. But everything else still works really well. And well, this is quite nice. So we are really making some good progress. Cool. And really all that's left to do now is to add a sound to it. And this is also really easily done. I first have to import a sound. and I've called mine punch sound. And this now happens with the keyword audio, and this is also a new class. And when we initiate this sound, we need again a file. And I have one in assets, and I called this punch_sound, and I did need the file ending. And now we have to specify a couple more things. The first one is loop, and this one is supposed to be false, because we only want one punch sound. And then I need autoplay, and this is also supposed to be false. And with that, we have imported our audio file. So now we have to figure out when to play it. And the one I went with, let me minimize all the other parts, is that whenever you click or delete one of these cubes, then we are going to play the sound. And all I have to do to play a sound is to get the sound itself and then play. And I want to do this for both creating and deleting a block. So let me put this above destroy. That feels better. And now if we try all of this, I think I made one mistake. Let me get out of it. So right now the sound is kind of double playing. And the reason is, well, quite simple. That whenever I call the input method and we're hovering over any of the buttons, then we are playing the sound. But I only want to play the sound if we're actually pressing it. So that way it's going to work properly. And now let's try this again. And this is feeling so much better. And cool. This is basically the finished game. There are a couple of tiny things that you can do. And, well, they're really tiny basic things. So let me do it all the way at the top. What we could do, for example, is window.fps_counter.enabled is true right now, but I want this to be false. So that we can see a tiny number in the top right. So this, I feel, makes the game look a bit nicer. And since we're not using the escape button, we can also hide that one. So window.exit_button.visible is equal to false. And now we get the whole window. And this is literally what I have showed you earlier at the beginning of this video. Really, what you can do now is just keep on building different blocks and just add more and more stuff towards it. And get rid of stuff if you don't like it. It works pretty well. So, well, that's pretty much it. There are a couple of things you do want to be aware of. Number one is that, well, lots of things are missing. That we don't have an inventory, we only create a very basic square, and not much is happening yet. So if you wanted to expand this entire thing, you would have to add quite a bit more code. Because in the current setup, if you add too many blocks, the game slows down very noticeably. So this would be one thing to work on. Number two is that if you look very closely at the textures, you can see it very well here, is that there are lots of little seams between them, which happens because I didn't spend too much time making them because this is just a demo. But if you spend a bit more time on them, you can make them look much nicer. And, well, you can also add an inventory and lots more tiny things. But, well, what you have so far is essentially a basic start for the game. So if you play around with more, you can probably make quite a bit more of this. So I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you around. Bye!